They say you can tell everything about a regiment by how they react to incoming fire. Cadians drop and return volley with practiced precision. Kadishans melt into whatever cover exists, already flanking before the echo fades. Vostroyans form ranks, their firstborn pride refusing to yield an inch of ground without blood price extracted. The Death Korps? They don't react at all. They stand there, entrenching tools biting into frozen earth, methodical as clockwork. Shells scream overhead, close enough that the pressure wave should send any sane man diving for cover. The Kriegers keep digging. Artillery impacts 20 meters away, showering them with debris and worse. They keep digging. A man to their left simply ceases to exist, reduced to component molecules by a direct hit. The soldier beside him shifts slightly to fill the gap in the line and continues working. No fear, no anger, no hesitation. Just the steady chunk of sharpened steel breaking earth that hasn't seen sunlight in 10,000 years. This is what breaks other regiments, not the dying. Every guardsman knows they're probably gonna die. That's part of the contract signed when you put on the uniform. It's the silence that does it. The absolute mechanical indifference to their own mortality. Watch a Krieger take a loss round through the shoulder, and they'll switch their rifle to the other hand without breaking stride. See them pull a wounded comrade from the mud, not to save him, but to retrieve his ammunition and rebreather before returning to formation. Stand beside them in the trenches and realize with creeping horror that the person next to you doesn't consider themselves a person at all. Their currency, biological ammunition, the Emperor's coin, spent without hesitation on the galaxy's bloodiest markets. And the worst part? They chose this. Not individually. Kriegers don't make individual choices. That would require individuality. But collectively, as a world, as a culture, as a species of guilt-made flesh. Somewhere in their past, something happened that convinced an entire planet that existence itself was a sin requiring eternal atonement. This is the story of that sin, of how paradise became ash, of how love for the Emperor twisted into something monstrous, of how Colonel Jurten of the 83rd Krieg Regiment made a choice that damned billions to save their souls, and in doing so created the Imperium's most effective killers and most tragic victims. The Death Korps don't have names anymore, don't have faces, don't have futures, but they had a past. And that past is written in radiation and ice and the bones of 500 billion souls who couldn't be saved, so they were purified instead. The masks never come off. That's the first thing you need to understand about the Death Korps of Krieg. Other regiments have their quirks, their traditions, their peculiar customs born from the cultures of their homeworlds. But those are additions to the standard template of Imperial Guard service. Decorations layered atop the fundamental humanity underneath. The Krieg masks aren't decoration, they're amputation. Commissar Helena Faust, assigned to the 143rd Krieg Siege Regiment during the Varden 4 compliance action, kept a personal journal that later found its way into Departamento Militarum archives. Her early entries read like textbook observations, unit strength, equipment status, tactical assessments. Professional, detached. But 3 weeks into the campaign, her tone shifts. I gave the order to advance at dawn, no acknowledgement. They simply stood, checked their equipment with mechanical precision, and began moving forward. No battle cant, no prayers. No last words to comrades who might not survive the day. The silence is wrong. I've served with Cadians who joked as they loaded magazines, with Kadishans who sang obscene songs while sharpening knives. Even the penal legions cursed their fate. But these? They move like servitors. But servitors don't dig graves for their fallen with such terrible care. 2 months later, I ordered a squad to fall back from an untenable position. They stared at me, or I assumed they did, Impossible to tell through those damned masks. And the squad sergeant finally responded, "Commissar, respectfully, the Emperor's will is that we hold this ground." I repeated the order. They obeyed, but slowly, reluctantly, as if I'd asked them to commit some obscene act. That night I found them digging punishment trenches as penance for retreating. I didn't order that. They did it themselves. 6 months in, I shot one today. Not for cowardice, impossible concept with these men, but for the opposite. He'd rigged himself as a walking bomb, planning to charge an enemy bunker solo. Suicide attack, no chance of survival, minimal tactical gain. When I confronted him, he seemed disappointed, confused, can't read expressions through skull masks. He asked what he'd done wrong, explained that his death would serve the Emperor. I tried to explain that throwing away lives for minimal gain is wasteful. He didn't understand. To him, waste isn't dying for nothing. Waste is living when you could have died for something. The final entry, I requested transfer. Command denied it. Said I'm one of the few commissars the Kriegers haven't driven mad. That's their metric for success now, not driving your commissar insane. What does it say about the Imperium that its most effective soldiers are the ones who've already lost their minds? The masks are skull-faced usually. Not always. Some regiments favor simpler designs, just the functional brutality of rubberized canvas and glass lenses. But the skull motif dominates. It's not meant to intimidate the enemy. Most Krieg combat occurs at artillery range anyway. Distances where such details dissolve into the general horror of industrial scale death. No, the skulls are for the wearers. A meditation on mortality. A promise made manifest. I am already dead. I died when Krieg fell. I'm just waiting for the Emperor to collect his due. Underneath the masks, that's where things get complicated. The Inquisition demanded to know, of course. When the Death Korps first emerged from their centuries of isolation, when their ships translated into Imperial space broadcasting ancient recognition codes and requesting deployment orders, the Ordo Hereticus had questions. Many questions. Planets don't just fall silent for 500 years and come back unchanged. Something must have happened. Chaos corruption, perhaps? Xenos infiltration. Some dark bargain that explained their unnatural effectiveness. Inquisitor Varick of the Ordo Hereticus personally inspected the first Krieg regiments. His report is still classified, but fragments have leaked over the millennia. Subject: initial assessment of Death Korps was tied. Regiments. Compliance inspection completed on regiments designated 83rd through 92nd, all claiming origin from Krieg Secundus, previously Krieg Prime. Reclassified as Death World following civil conflict. Physical examination of 200 specimens, selected at random, reveals human baseline genetics with notable deviations. Unusually high tolerance for radiation, suggesting long-term exposure and adaptation. Enhanced lung capacity, environmental compensation for toxic atmosphere. Genetic markers indicating. Redacted by order of Departamento Militarum. When ordered to remove respirators, subjects complied without hesitation. Faces beneath are human. Caucasian phenotype predominates. Age range 16 to 23, Terran standard. Notable scarring from chemical exposure. Pale complexion consistent with subterranean habitation. No visible mutations, no signs of warp taint. However, psychological examination reveals profound abnormalities. Subjects display no individual personality markers. Responses to questions are identical across all specimens tested, suggesting either intense conditioning or redacted. When asked for names, subjects provide numerical designations only. When pressed, they seem confused by the concept of personal identity. Most disturbing. When asked, "What do you want?" unanimous response was to die for the Emperor. Not to serve, not to fight, not even to win. To die, as if death itself is the objective, and combat merely the means of achieving it. Recommendation: continued monitoring. Potential theological deviation from approved Imperial creed. However, combat effectiveness is unprecedented. Colonel Thanes reports his stalled offensive on Vorton. 3 breakthrough achieved within 72 hours of Krieg deployment. Casualties: 94% of Krieg forces committed. Success rate: 100% of objectives secured. They're dying at rates that would break any other regiment. But they keep requesting harder deployments, begging for them in their emotionless way. Emperor preserve us, I think they mean it. The masks stay on because underneath them are people who've forgotten how to be people. Or perhaps, and this is worse, they're people who were never taught how to be people in the first place. Krieg doesn't send the Imperium its sons and daughters. It sends the Imperium its apologies, wrapped in flesh and greatcoats, armed with shovels and the absolute certainty that they deserve to die. Understanding why requires going back before the masks, before the silence, before the Death Korps existed, back to paradise. Krieg wasn't always a graveyard. In the early years of M40, before the Civil War, before the Purging, before everything turned to ash and ice and endless apology, Krieg was prosperous, not remarkable by the standards of the Imperium's countless hive worlds. It wouldn't make anyone's list of crown jewels in humanity's domain, but successful, stable, a functioning cog in the great machine, producing its quota of manufactured goods and paying its tithes on time, like a good imperial world should. The planet's 3 major hive cities, Farograd, Oros, and Argentus, house tens of billions. Standard hive configuration: upper spires for the wealthy and administratum officials, middle levels for workers and minor merchants, underhive darkness for everyone else. The architecture was Gothic imperial standard, all buttresses and gargoyles and cathedral-like manufactorums that turned raw ore into tanks. To weapons, into the 10,000 things the Imperium constantly devours. But here's what the records don't convey. What gets lost in the dry language of census data and production quotas. People lived there. Not just existed, not just survived. Lived. Had families, told jokes, fell in love. Complained about the weather, mild by hive world standards. Krieg had actual seasons then, real weather patterns. Not the nuclear winter that came later. The upper hive had theaters where traveling troops performed approved imperial dramas. The middle hive had markets that smelled of spices and roasted groks and the particular electric ozone scent of freshly printed propaganda posters. There was culture, art even, within the approved parameters. The Cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant in Hive Oros was famous throughout the sector for its stained glass depicting the Unification Wars. Pilgrims came from nearby systems to pray beneath its vaulted ceilings, to trace their fingers along inscriptions written in languages dead before the age of strife. The cathedral's bells could be heard for kilometers, ringing out the hours in 7-part harmony, a sound so beautiful that even hardened gang fighters in the Underhive would pause when the evening toll echoed down through the city's levels. That cathedral's dust now. Radioactive dust, specifically, glowing faintly in the dark whenever the wind stirs it into brief, ghostly life. The people who built it, who maintained it, who prayed there, also dust. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Krieg's prosperity came from its industries. The planet sat on massive deposits of rare minerals. Nothing unique. The galaxy's full of such worlds, but the deposits were accessible, close to the surface, easy to mine. Combine that with the stable population and decent infrastructure, and you've got a world that produces more than it consumes. The excess went to the Imperium, of course. That's how it works. But enough remained that the planetary economy thrived. The ruling class, and there's always a ruling class, might as well call it what it is, consisted of the Hive Lords and their associated bloodlines. Old families, most of them, who'd held power since before Krieg's incorporation into the Imperium 10,000 years prior. They weren't particularly cruel by imperial standards. Corruption existed naturally, nepotism, the usual rot that sets in when the same names appear on the same governing documents for centuries. But it was manageable rot, the kind you could work around, build despite, survive within. What they were was proud, immensely, catastrophically proud. See, Krieg's industries made the planet valuable. Invaluable planets get attention, trade contracts, favorable tithe assessments, the kind of economic relationships that translate into wealth and influence. Over generations, this led to a particular mindset among the ruling elite. We're important. We matter. The Imperium needs us more than we need it. Dangerous thought that. Heretical even. Though not in the chaos sense. More in the practical sense of forgetting your place in the grand hierarchy. But it festered, grew, metastasized into something that looked almost like independence. The private armies started small. All major hive cities maintained security forces. You have to when billions of people are stacked on top of each other in metal towers, prone to gang violence and industrial accidents and the occasional underhive cult. But Krieg's hive lords took it further. They competed with each other, you see. Not open. That would be unseemly. But in that way, powerful families always compete. Whose militia had better equipment? Whose soldiers were more disciplined? Whose private military could respond faster to threats? It was a game at first. Status signal. Then it became something else. By M40.400, each major hive city fielded forces that would have been considered small armies on most worlds. Not PDF, planetary defense forces, those still existed separately, but private military contractors loyal to individual governors or families. The equipment was good too. Not Space Marine quality, obviously, but better than standard guard issue. Custom laser guns, imported armor. Some families even had tanks, though they kept those in reserve, waiting for what? What were they preparing for? The official answer, if you asked, defense against external threats. Xenos, pirates, chaos cultists, all real dangers in the 41st millennium. The real answer? Each other. And eventually, inevitably, the Imperium itself. Life for ordinary citizens continued much as it always had. Wake in your hab cell. Report to your manufacturing ship. Work 16 hours. Return, sleep, repeat. The ecclesiarchy provided spiritual comfort and a framework for understanding suffering as divine will. The Arbites maintained order. The administratum counted everything and demanded more. It was grim, of course. This is the 41st millennium. Everything's grim. But it was functional grimness, sustainable misery. Children played in the regulated recreation sectors. Families gathered for prayer on the Emperor's holy days. Young men and women were drafted into PDF service, or, if unlucky, tithed to the guard, and shipped off-world to fight and probably die for the Imperium. This was normal, expected. The way things had always been would always be. No one imagined it could end. Not really. End implies change, and the Imperium doesn't change. It endures. That's the whole point. But in the upper spires, in the council chambers where hive lords gathered beneath golden aquilas and portraits of the Emperor, change was brewing. They'd started doing the mathematics, calculating what they gave versus what they received, looking at casualty reports from guard regiments recruited from Krieg and seeing the names, their world's children, sent to die in wars they'd never benefit from, on worlds they'd never see. And they started asking a question that, once asked, cannot be unasked. Why? Why should our sons bleed for the Imperium when the Imperium treats us as disposable? Why should we send our best minds, our strongest warriors, our precious resources to Terra's endless war when we could keep them here? Protect ourselves? Build something for us instead of the faceless billions consuming our production? Why are we slaves when we could be free? Heresy starts small, a question, a doubt. A perfectly reasonable observation that, followed to its logical conclusion, leads somewhere dark and irreversible. The aristocracy of Krieg followed that logic. They did the math. They looked at their private armies and their industrial capacity and their wealth, and they convinced themselves of a beautiful lie. We don't need the Imperium. The Imperium needs us. In M40.496, the Departamento Militarum issued a standard requisition order. Krieg was to provide 12 new regiments for guard service, about 120,000 men, plus increased production quotas for lace guns and armor plating to support the Macarian Crusade aftermath campaigns. The planetary governor, a man whose name has been deliberately erased from imperial records, but whom we'll call the chairman, that's how he titled himself in his later proclamations, looked at the order and made a decision that would doom his world. He refused. Not publicly at first. He sent back petitions, requested extensions, cited production difficulties and population concerns, bureaucratic resistance dressed in the language of loyal compliance, the administratum, drowning in paperwork from 10,000 worlds, filed his responses and moved on. They'd circle back eventually. But the chairman didn't wait. He began consolidating power, bringing the other hive lords into his coalition, presenting his case. Look how much we give. Look how little we receive in return. We could be an independent system, defend ourselves, keep what we make, build our own future. Some refused, fled to loyalist strongholds, sent desperate astropathic messages to the Imperium, begging for intervention. Most joined him, because the lie was beautiful and they wanted to believe. And so Krieg, prosperous industrial world, loyal tithe giver, began its slow slide toward rebellion. All it needed was a spark, a catalyst. Someone the loyalists could rally around, someone with the authority to resist. That's where Colonel Jurten enters the story. Colonel Jurten didn't want to save Krieg. He wanted to purify it. There's a distinction there, subtle but crucial. That explains everything that came after. If he'd wanted to save the planet, he might have tried diplomacy harder, accepted compromises, found some middle path between the chairman's independence fantasies and the Imperium's absolute dominion. But Jurten wasn't interested in preservation. He was interested in righteousness. And righteous men are capable of horrors that would make devils weep. He arrived in system in M40.500, commanding the 83rd Krieg Regiment, fresh from a successful campaign against Chaos cultists in the Hadris Reach. The 83rd had distinguished themselves. Multiple commendations, low casualty rates by guard standards, excellent combat performance. Jurten himself was a known quantity to the Militarum, competent, loyal, perhaps a touch fanatical in his devotion to the Emperor. But that's hardly unusual in guard officers. If anything, it was a positive trait. He'd been summoned home because the Inquisition was starting to notice Krieg's reluctance to provide tithes. An inquisitor named Vraks had interrogated Jurten personally during his previous campaign, fishing for information about his homeworld's politics. Jurten had been forthcoming, perhaps too much so. He'd confirmed the Inquisitor's suspicions. Yes, the planetary government was becoming increasingly resistant to imperial authority. Yes, the private armies were growing beyond reasonable defense needs. Yes, there seemed to be elements within the aristocracy advocating for independence. He'd said the word like it tasted of poison. The Inquisitor had given him orders: return to Krieg, investigate, report back. If the situation was salvageable, stabilize it. If not, well, the orders after if not were classified. But Jurten understood his role. He was the Imperium's scalpel, sent to excise a potentially gangrenous limb before infection spread. He arrived at Krieg expecting resistance. What he found was worse. He found people who thought they were right. The chairman, in historical fragments, suggest he was charismatic in person, which explains a lot. Made his case directly to Jurten in their first meeting. Invited him to the planetary governor's palace in Hive Oros. Treated him as a guest, as an equal. as a fellow son of Krieg who surely understood the world's grievances. Records of that conversation don't exist. Both men are long dead, and neither left detailed accounts. But we can reconstruct the broad strokes from later events and secondhand sources. The chairman explained his position. Krieg had been loyal for 10,000 years, paid its tithes, sent its soldiers, asked for nothing in return except what any world deserves: protection, fair treatment, respect. Instead, the Imperium treated them as a resource to be exploited, demanded more and more, gave back less and less. Young men conscripted and sent to die in wars they had no stake in. Production quotas that strained the planet's industries to breaking. And for what? For Terra's distant wars? For a throne world that barely remembered Krieg existed? It wasn't sustainable. It wasn't right, and the chairman had made a decision. Krieg would stand independent, would defend itself with its own armies, would keep what it produced for its own people. They weren't traitors. They still revered the Emperor, still prayed to him, still followed his light. They just didn't owe Terra anything, didn't owe the Administratum, didn't owe the Imperium's endless grinding war machine that consumed worlds and spat out corpses. "Join us," the chairman said. "You're a son of Krieg. You understand. Help us build something better." Jurten's response was immediate and absolute. No. Not because the chairman was wrong about the Imperium's cruelty. Jurten knew better than most how the war machine worked, how it crushed individuals beneath its treads without thought or mercy. He'd seen it up close, commanded men who died for objectives that turned out to be irrelevant, watched logistics failures kill more soldiers than the enemy ever could. But none of that mattered, because the Imperium, cruel and inefficient and monstrous as it was still necessary. The alternative wasn't independence and prosperity. The alternative was annihilation. Chaos would devour independent human worlds. Xenos would enslave them. The galaxy was too hostile, too fundamentally hostile to human life for anything but unified force to survive. And beyond practical concerns, there was faith. Jurten believed, truly believed, with the kind of certainty that scorches the soul, that the Emperor's will was absolute, that suffering in his service was holy, that questioning his Imperium was questioning him. The chairman had committed heresy, not chaos heresy, not yet, but the deeper heresy of pride, of thinking human judgment could override divine will. Jurten left the meeting knowing what he had to do, knowing it would cost everything. The chairman, for his part, made his own calculations. He'd hoped to sway Jurten peacefully, to bring the 83rd Regiment into the fold as a legitimizing force. When that failed, he had 3 days. He generously gave all off-worlders 3 days to leave before Krieg formally declared independence to decide Jurten's fate. He chose poorly. The chairman ordered Jurten contained, not killed, placed under house arrest in Hive Ferrograd, along with those elements of the 83rd who remained ostentatiously loyal to the Imperium. It was meant to be temporary, a holding action, while the chairman consolidated power. Instead, it gave Jurten exactly what he needed: time, a defensible position, and the moral high ground. On the third day, the chairman made his announcement, standing before crowds in Hive Oros, broadcast across all 3 cities and into orbit. He proclaimed Krieg's independence, renounced the Imperium's authority, claimed sovereignty in the Emperor's name, clever that, wrapping rebellion in religious language, and declared the establishment of the free system of Krieg. Watching from Ferrograd, Jurten heard the proclamation and immediately began fortifying his position. The Civil War didn't start with a bang. It started with uncertainty. Civilians in Ferrograd woke up one morning to hear they were no longer part of the Imperium, then heard different announcements saying they still were. Conflicting orders from conflicting authorities. In the Underhive, life continued as normal. Whoever was in charge didn't matter when you were just trying to survive. But in the middle and upper levels, confusion reigned. Until Jurten seized control. He was methodical about it. identified traitor elements within Ferograd's administration and military, had them executed publicly, swiftly, efficiently, rallied loyalists to the Imperial banner, established martial law. Within a week, Hive Ferograd belonged to the Emperor again. One city, 3 billion souls, against the combined might of Oros and Argentus, with their populations of 40 billion and the chairman's private armies. The mathematics were stark. Jurten couldn't win militarily, not conventionally. He didn't have the numbers, didn't have the resources, didn't have hope of Imperial reinforcement arriving in time. But he had faith, and faith in sufficient concentration can rot through reason like acid through flesh. His daughter, Captain Sabala Jurten, complicated matters. She'd served in the planetary PDF assigned to Oros before the rebellion. When the chairman proclaimed independence, she should have fled to Ferograd, to her father's loyalist stronghold. Instead, she volunteered to lead a strike team against him. This could have been loyalty to the chairman, could have been genuine belief in independence, could have been the opposite, deep cover, pretending to turn traitor to get close to loyalist forces. We'll never know. She died during an assault on the chairman's compound, killed by gas weapons deployed by loyalist infiltrators. Whether she was hero or traitor, died with her. Jurten received the news without visible emotion, ordered her body recovered and buried with military honors, moved on to the next item on his tactical assessment. This is important, because it shows what kind of man he was. Not heartless. Reports from subordinates suggest he grieved privately, fiercely, but capable of compartmentalizing personal tragedy, of putting duty above family, of making the calculation that individual lives, even beloved ones, mattered less than the collective mission. That capacity would serve him well in the months ahead, when he'd have to make a choice that would kill not one daughter, but billions. The siege began in earnest. The chairman's forces, superior in every measurable way, surrounded Ferograd and began the slow, grinding process of starving it out. Artillery barrages, airstrikes, infiltration attempts, standard siege tactics executed with professional efficiency. His forces held. Barely. They turned Ferograd's manufactorums to war production. Every able body pressed into service. Dug trenches along the city's outer precincts. Mined approaches. Fortified every defensible position. And waited for the Imperium to send help. The Imperium, of course, had other problems. The astropathic message about Krieg's rebellion reached Terra, was filed, was assessed. A world in revolt required response, yes, but not immediate response. The Imperium was vast. Rebellions happened constantly. Most burned themselves out. Those that didn't would be dealt with when fleets became available. Krieg could wait. 18 months into the siege, with casualties mounting and no relief in sight, Jurten received orders via astropathic communication. The message was fragmentary. Psychic transmission across light years is imprecise at best. But the core directive was clear. Hold, resist, deny planet to traitors. Reinforcements delayed, any means necessary. Any means necessary. Jurten read those words and understood what the Imperium was really saying. You're on your own, we can't save you, but don't let them win. Die if you must. Just make them pay for it. And if the planet can't be saved, well, better a dead world loyal to the Emperor than a living one in rebellion. Jurten took the message to his inner council, showed them the grim calculus. They were outnumbered, outgunned, would lose eventually through attrition if nothing changed. So something had to change. That's when Archmagos Grell spoke up, mentioned something he'd discovered in the deep vaults beneath Ferograd. Something from the dark age of technology. Something that could end the war at terrible, terrible cost. The vaults beneath Hive Ferograd were older than the Imperium. Older than the Age of Strife. ancient storage chambers from when humanity reached for the stars and briefly, gloriously touched them before the fall. Most had been sealed for millennia, their contents forgotten or forbidden. The Mechanicus cataloged them obsessively but rarely opened them. Too much risk, too much unknown. Dark Age technology was miraculous and cursed in equal measure. Devices that could terraform worlds or unmake them. Weapons that violated the laws of physics as the Imperium understood them. AI constructs that thought and dreamed and went mad. Archmagos Grell had opened one vault, found something specific, and kept it secret until the moment it could serve the Omnissiahs, and by extension the Emperor's will. Atomic weapons. Not the crude fusion warheads the Imperium still deployed. Not even the more sophisticated plasma weapons the Mechanicus guarded jealously. These were Dark Age atomics, engineered with principles that modern tech priests could barely comprehend. Each warhead carried enough destructive potential to annihilate a hive city. Not damage it, not cripple it, erase it. Turn millions of tons of metal and stone and flesh into superheated plasma, then radioactive dust, then nothing but shadow marks on the ground where buildings once stood. The vault contained 47 warheads. Grell explained their function to Jurten in the cold language of technical specifications. Yield measurements, detonation altitudes, fallout patterns. He was Mechanicus. He dealt in numbers, in measurable outcomes, in the sacred mathematics of cause and effect. Jurten listened with the perfect stillness of a man watching his soul die. "We could use one," he said finally. "Target Hive Oros. Decapitate the rebellion's leadership. Force surrender." Grell made the clicking sound that his augmented vocal system used for negation. "Missile delivery is too slow. Their air defenses would intercept. Even if one struck, the chairman's likely in hardened bunkers deep enough to survive. You'd kill millions, destroy infrastructure, and achieve nothing. Then what use are they?" The Archmagos tilted his head, a disturbingly human gesture from someone who was more machine than flesh. "You're thinking like a soldier. Think like a... what's the term your species uses? Fanatic." Jurten's officers were listening. Captain Corvette, his second in command. Major Thrask, head of Faragrad's defense, a dozen others, all loyal, all desperate, all looking to him for salvation. "Explain," Jurten said. "The chairman wants Krieg intact. That's his entire argument, that independence will preserve the world's prosperity, its culture, its people. He's waging limited war, trying to break your defensive capacity without destroying the productive infrastructure he needs to rule. Yes, and deny him that objective. Make independence meaningless. Make the planet worthless." The silence in the room was absolute. Someone tried to speak, choked on the words. Jurten understood immediately. "You're suggesting atmospheric detonation. Maximize fallout. Poison the entire planet. The warheads contain enough radioactive material to contaminate Krieg for centuries. 10,000 years, perhaps. The ecosystem would collapse within weeks. The atmosphere would become toxic. Any population remaining on the surface would sicken and die." That's genocide," Major Thrask said. "We'd kill everyone, not just the rebels. Everyone." Grell's mechanical eyes, glowing red photoreceptors set in a face more metal than skin, fixed on the Major. "Not everyone. Those sealed in hive cities with proper environmental controls could survive. Faragrad's population is already living in contained conditions. We could outlast the worst contamination. For what?" Korvan asked. "To rule over ashes? To deny the traitors their prize?" Jurten said quietly. "They want independence. We give them a wasteland so toxic that independence becomes a death sentence. Then we wait. The Imperium will come eventually, and when they do, they'll find loyalists who held against impossible odds, who sacrificed everything to preserve the Emperor's dominion. He was rationalizing it, even as he spoke, feeling his way through the logic, the theology, the cold calculus of who deserved to die and why. "Sir," Vraks said, "the civilians in Oros and Argentus, they're not all traitors. Most had no choice. They're just living, following whoever's in charge because that's what you do to survive. They accepted the chairman's rule, didn't riot, didn't resist. Their compliance enabled this rebellion. They're scared. There's a difference between supporting rebellion and just trying not to get killed." Jurten looked at his officer for a long moment. Then, "Do you have an alternative? Some other plan that breaks the siege before we starve?" Thrask had nothing. None of them did. "Any means necessary," Jurten repeated, reciting the Imperium's order like scripture. "That's what we were told. Any means necessary." The first dissent came from within his own staff. Officers who'd served with him for decades, who knew him as a hard man but a just one, a commander who valued his soldiers' lives and spent them only when victory demanded it. They saw what he was becoming and tried to intervene. Captain Corvin requested a private meeting, tried to reason with him, pointed out that Colonel Jurten of the 83rd had always believed in proportional response, in achieving objectives with minimum casualties, in the fundamental dignity of human life, even within the Imperium's grinding war machine. "That man died when the Imperium abandoned us," Jurten said. "We weren't abandoned, sir. We were told to hold." "There's a difference, is there? They're not coming, Corvan." "Not in time. Maybe not ever. Do you know what the Militarum does with besieged worlds that can't break their own sieges? They write them off, classify them as lost, move on. In 50 years, maybe 100, a fleet will arrive to find either a thriving rebel system or a dead world. If it's the former, they'll spend years reconquering it, waste billions of lives on a compliance campaign. If it's the latter," he paused. "If it's the latter, they'll send a single survey team, confirm loyalty, and restore it to Imperial records. Minimal cost. So we kill billions to save the Imperium time and resources. We kill billions to save their souls. That's what you're not understanding. The people of Oros and Argentus, they're living under traitor rule, accepting it. Every day they don't rebel. Every moment they continue their lives as if independence is acceptable. They're complicit. They're damning themselves." Corvan stared at him. "You can't possibly believe that." "I believe what the Emperor teaches. That loyalty is everything. That service to the Imperium is service to him. That there's no neutrality in this war. You're either loyal or you're traitor. And the traitors," Jurten's voice dropped to something cold and dead, "the traitors are already lost. We'd just be expediting the inevitable." The meeting ended badly. Corvan left convinced that his colonel had lost his mind. He wasn't wrong exactly. But it wasn't madness in the chaos sense. No warp corruption eating at Jurten's sanity. It was something more mundane and more terrifying. Absolute certainty. The kind that burns away doubt, mercy, hesitation. The kind that lets you do anything because you know with perfect clarity that you're right. Within a week, Corvan and 3 other senior officers attempted a coup, tried to relieve Jurten of command, planned to contact the chairman and negotiate surrender terms that would spare the civilian populations. Jurten had anticipated this. Had loyalists among the ranks, younger officers, true believers, men who'd drunk deeply from the same well of faith that had sustained him. When Corvan's faction made their move, Jurten's supporters were waiting. The fighting was brief, vicious but brief. Guard fought guard in the corridors of Ferograd's command fortress. Brothers killing brothers over an ideological schism that would have seemed insane to anyone outside Jurten's inner circle. Jurten personally executed Corvan, shot him in the command center in front of the remaining staff, made it clear that there would be no more debate, no more hesitation, no more mercy for those who question the Emperor's will as interpreted through him. "We are the Imperium's last loyal servants on this world," he said, Corvan's body still cooling at his feet. "And we will do what the Imperium cannot. We will purge the traitors. All of them, even if we have to burn the planet to ash to do it. Archmagos Grell watched all this with the dispassionate interest of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. Later, in his personal logs, recovered centuries afterward, he'd write, "Subject Jurten displays remarkable psychological adaptation to extreme circumstances. Lesser humans fracture under such pressure. He has instead crystallized, hardened into something pure and terrible." It's quite beautiful in its way. The Omnissiah teaches that flesh is weak, but here I see flesh transcending its limitations through sheer force of will. He's becoming a machine of faith. I wonder if he'll survive the transition. The preparation took months. Grell supervised personally, bringing in his most trusted tech priests to ready the warheads. They were old, these weapons. 10,000 years in storage, maybe more. Components had degraded. Plutonium cores needed reprocessing. Guidance systems had to be completely rebuilt using modern, or at least less ancient, technology. The Mechanicus worked with religious fervor, because that's what it was to them. A sacrament. Recovering lost knowledge, putting it to use in service of the machine god in the Imperium. The fact that these particular machines would kill billions was irrelevant. Machines had no morality. They simply were, and they served. Jurten spent those months preparing himself. Officers who survived the purge reported seeing him in the chapel at all hours, kneeling before the golden aquila, lips moving in silent prayer. He stopped sleeping more than an hour to a night, lost weight, developed a tremor in his left hand that he suppressed through sheer will whenever anyone was watching. He was, quite literally, dying inside. The part of him that was human, that valued individual life, that understood the enormity of what he was planning, that part was being systematically murdered by the part that valued obedience, duty, faith. And the faith part was winning. 3 months before launch, he received one final communication from General Kraus, the military commander of the rebel forces. Kraus had replaced the chairman after the failed assassination. The man himself had withered away, some said, consumed by the stress of rule and the weight of his decisions. Kraus was more pragmatic, more willing to negotiate. The message was simple. We can end this, bloodlessly. I'll guarantee safety for all loyalists in Ferrograd. You'll be allowed to leave the planet, regroup with the Imperium. We keep Krieg, you keep your lives and honor. No more death necessary. Jurten's response was shorter, no. Colonel, be reasonable, you're besieged. We outnumber you 50 to 1. Even if you hold for another year, 2 years, eventually we'll break through. Your people will die for nothing. They'll die for the Emperor. There's no higher purpose. The Emperor's dead, Jurten. Has been for 10,000 years. We're fighting over the corpse of a god who doesn't care. That was the line that sealed it. The final proof, if Jurten needed any, that the rebels were beyond redemption. Not just politically rebellious, but spiritually corrupt, denying the Emperor's divinity, rejecting the fundamental truth that sustained the Imperium. He ended the transmission without another word and gave Grell the order. Prepare for launch. All warheads. Simultaneous deployment. Atmospheric dispersion pattern, maximum coverage. I want every continent, every ocean, every island touched by fallout. Make it so nothing lives on the surface for 10,000 years. The civilian casualties are acceptable, necessary, holy even. We're cleansing this world, Archmagos, burning away the rot so that what remains is pure. Grell's mechanical face couldn't smile, but something in his posture suggested approval. Understood, Colonel. The Omnissiahs will be done. The Emperor's will, Jurten corrected. Is there a difference? The question hung in the air unanswered. Launch day was clear. One of those perfect Krieg mornings that would soon become impossible. Blue sky, mild temperature, gentle wind carrying the smell of the planet's few remaining forests. The kind of day that reminded you what paradise looked like before you burned it. Jurten stood on Faragrad's upper ramparts and watched the first missiles lift. Slow at first. These were old designs using chemical propulsion rather than more sophisticated Imperial drives, but accelerating steadily. 47 contrails riding humanity's death sentence across the sky. Across the planet, in Oros and Argentus and the smaller settlements, people stopped what they were doing and looked up, tried to understand what they were seeing. Some thought it was a conventional attack. Others didn't know what to think. General Kraus, watching from Oros Command Center, understood immediately. Tried to order interceptors launched, point defense activated, anything to stop what was coming. Too slow. The missiles weren't targeting cities directly. They were rising straight up, reaching for the stratosphere. "He's not trying to hit us," Kraus's tactical officer said. The first detonation came at 80,000 meters, a brief sun born and dying in the upper atmosphere. Then another. 87 new stars blooming across Krieg's sky, each one vomiting megatons of radioactive material into the jet streams. The light was beautiful, in a horrible way. Brilliant colors painting the clouds, reds and purples and greens that shouldn't exist in nature. People on the ground stopped and stared, mesmerized, not yet understanding that they were watching their own death sentence being carried out. The fallout began within hours, not the dramatic firestorms of a surface detonation. Jurten had been precise about that, calculating exactly how to maximize long-term contamination while minimizing immediate destruction. The hive cities themselves remained standing, but the air became poison. It started as ash, gentle at first, like snow, drifting down from the bruised sky. People caught it on their tongues, curious. Then the ash turned to rain. Acid rain burning through clothes, searing exposed skin. People ran for cover, screaming, not yet understanding that cover wouldn't save them. That the poison was everywhere now. In the air they breathed, the water they drank, the food they ate. The hive cities sealed their environmental systems too late. Contamination had already entered through 1,000 small breaches. Ventilation systems, damaged infrastructure from the siege, simple human error. Within days, radiation sickness began appearing. Nausea, hair loss, skin lesions that wouldn't heal. Within weeks, people were dying in numbers that overwhelmed the morgues. Kraus sent one final message to Jurten before the communications arrays failed. "You've murdered a world." Jurten's response was the last transmission ever sent from Hive Oros before its systems collapsed. "I've saved it." And in some twisted sense, in the calculus of faith that had consumed him utterly, he believed that. Truly believed it. The people of Oros and Argentus were traitors, had chosen rebellion over loyalty. Their deaths weren't murder, but judgment, execution of a sentence they'd passed on themselves when they failed to resist the chairman. That he'd killed billions who'd had no choice in any of this, who'd simply been born on the wrong world at the wrong time? That thought existed in his mind but couldn't gain purchase, couldn't compete with the absolute certainty that he'd done the Emperor's will. He'd saved Krieg, not the planet, not the people, but the idea of Krieg as a loyal Imperial world. And that idea, purchased in blood and radiation and the ashes of billions, was all that mattered. The purging was complete. Now came the penance. The planet died slowly. That was the worst part. If Jurten had targeted the hive cities directly, if he'd chosen the mercy of instant annihilation, at least the suffering would have been brief. Instead, he'd chosen maximum contamination, turned Krieg's atmosphere into a weapon that killed gradually, methodically, without possibility of escape. The first week, people still hoped, believed this was survivable. The hive cities went into lockdown protocols, sealed airlocks, activated air filtration, rationed water. For populations used to living in enclosed environments anyway, this seemed manageable. Unpleasant, sure, but temporary. The radiation would decay, the contamination would settle. Eventually, life would return to normal. It never would. The radiation levels weren't natural. Dark Age atomics didn't just split atoms. They corrupted them in ways that modern physics struggle to explain. Isotopes with half-lives measured in millennia. Particles that should have been impossible, maintaining coherence far longer than thermodynamics permitted. The Mechanicus tech priests examining the fallout patterns from Ferrograd couldn't explain it, could only document it with increasing horror. Krieg's ecosystem collapsed in real time. The forest died first. Trees that had stood for centuries simply stopped. Leaves blackened and fell within days. Then the grass. Then the crops in the agricultural zone. Entire continents of vegetation turning brown, then black, then ash. The planet's oxygen production, already supplemented by Hive City air processors, plummeted. The atmosphere itself began changing composition. More carbon dioxide, less oxygen, and strange trace elements that the monitoring equipment couldn't identify. The animals went next. Mass die-offs as radiation poisoned food sources and mutated genetic structures beyond sustainability. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight. Fish floated belly up in waters that glowed faintly at night. The few Krieg native megafauna, nothing exotic, just local variants of Terran species introduced during colonization, died in agony, their biology unable to cope with the new reality. In Hive Oros, General Kraus watched his world ending through vid screens that showed landscapes transforming into something alien and dead. He'd consolidated power after the chairman's deterioration, tried to organize a coherent response to Jurten's madness. But what response was it? You couldn't negotiate with fallout, couldn't fight radiation with soldiers. His population was dying. Slowly but unmistakably, the environmental seals had failed faster than anyone predicted. Not catastrophic failure, no dramatic breach, no sudden loss of atmosphere. Just degradation. Small cracks in systems stressed beyond their design parameters. Gaskets failing. Filters clogging with radioactive particulates, each breakdown minor in itself but collectively lethal. People started showing symptoms. The young and old first, their immune systems least capable of handling the cellular damage. Then the weak, then everyone. Nausea that wouldn't stop, hair falling out in clumps, sores opening on skin that wouldn't heal, that instead turned necrotic and black. The hospitals overflowed within the first month. By month 3, they'd stopped admitting new patients. There was no point. Radiation sickness didn't respond to treatment, not at these exposure levels. The doctors could make people comfortable. That was all. Kraus lasted longer than most. He was strong, physically fit, had access to the best medical care Oros could provide. But even he couldn't escape biology. The tremors started in his 4th month, then the bleeding from his gums, then the day he looked in the mirror and saw more hair on his pillow than on his head. He knew what was coming. The official Imperial records claim he took his own life, put a pistol to his temple rather than suffer the slow decay of radiation poison. It's a neat narrative, clean. The rebel commander facing the consequences of his rebellion and choosing to exit with some dignity intact. The truth was messier. Kraus tried to surrender, sent transmissions to Ferrograd begging for medical aid, for evacuation of the civilian populations, for something. Jurten ignored them all. When Kraus finally broke down and sent a personal plea, soldier to soldier, human to human, putting aside politics and pride, Jurten's response was a single line. You made your choice. Die with it. That's when Kraus realized what Jurten had really done. This wasn't war. Wasn't even punishment. This was sacrifice. Jurten had murdered his own planet as an offering to the Emperor. Proof of loyalty so extreme it transcended sanity. And Kraus and his people were just the currency of that transaction. The pistol wasn't suicide. It was mercy. self-administered, because no mercy would come from any other source. He wasn't the last to choose that path. The civilian population suffered worse. They'd never chosen rebellion, never even understood what was happening until it was far too late. Most had woken up one day to learn the planet had declared independence, shrugged, and continued their lives. When the missiles launched, they'd been as confused as anyone. Now they paid for sins they didn't commit. Families huddled in their hab cells as the contamination crept in. Parents watching children sicken, unable to do anything except hold them as the radiation destroyed their bodies cell by cell. The ecclesiarchy tried to provide comfort. Priests moving through the dying populations, offering final rites, promising the emperor's embrace awaited the faithful. But how faithful could you be when the emperor's representative had just killed you? Some kept praying anyway, clinging to faith because the alternative was admitting that your God had abandoned you, that loyalty meant nothing, that you died for bureaucratic politics and one man's fanaticism. Others broke. Riots in the lower hive levels where desperation overwhelmed the enforcers' ability to maintain order. Not rebellion exactly. Where would they rebel to? Just violence born of suffering with nowhere else to go. People attacking each other over the last clean water, the last uncontaminated food rations, the last spots in medical facilities that couldn't help them anyway. In Ferograd, Jurten watched the reports coming in from the other hive cities. Population figures declining, infrastructure collapsing, society fragmenting under the pressure of slow-motion apocalypse. He felt nothing, or that's what he told himself. The truth was more complicated. Late at night, alone in quarters, he rarely left anymore. He'd sometimes feel something trying to surface. Guilt, maybe, regret. The recognition that he'd killed his own people, murdered billions who'd trusted the Imperium to protect them. But he'd crush those feelings before they could take root. Remind himself, they were traitors, accepted rebel rule, failed in their duty to resist. Their deaths were just, necessary, holy. The mantra kept him functional, barely. His staff noticed the change. The colonel who'd been harsh but fair had become something else, something cold and mechanical. All humanity burned away, leaving only the function. He gave orders, received reports, made tactical decisions. But the man behind the colonel's rank, the person who'd once joked with subordinates and mourned dead soldiers, that man was gone. Archmagos Grell found the transformation fascinating, wrote extensive notes on it, theorized that extreme trauma could achieve what augmentation sometimes failed to, the complete sublimation of emotion, the triumph of logic over feeling. Jurten was becoming a perfect servant, a biological machine operating on pure faith logic. It was magnificent and horrifying. The environmental conditions worsened. Nuclear winter settled over Krieg as atmospheric particulates blocked the sun. Temperature dropped 40 degrees in the equatorial regions. The poles became uninhabitable. Not that anywhere was truly habitable anymore, but the poles went first. Ice sheets expanded. What little surface water remained froze. The planet's sky turned permanent gray-brown. Clouds thick with ash and worse things. Sometimes the clouds would rupture and rain would fall. Acid rain that stripped paint from buildings and flesh from bone if you were caught in it without protection. Jurten ventured to the surface once in the early days. Needed to see with his own eyes what he'd wrought, he wore a rebreather, proto-version of what would become the iconic Krieg gas mask, and heavy cold weather gear. Stood on Ferograd's outer ramparts and looked across the landscape transformed. Where there'd been fields, now wasteland. Where there'd been forests, skeleton trees black against poison snow. The wind carried ash that stung exposed skin even through protective layers. The sky pressed down like a weight, heavy and wrong and full of death. He stood there for an hour, silent, unmoving. When he finally returned inside, his staff asked if he'd seen anything significant, any threat that needed addressing. No, Jurten said. Just the price of loyalty. They didn't ask what he meant. The siege ended not with battle, but with silence. The trench lines between Ferrograd and the rebel positions simply emptied. The soldiers on the other side died at their posts or abandoned them to die somewhere else. No final assault. No last stand. Just the gradual cessation of organized resistance as the traitor forces dissolved. Jurten sent out patrols. Death Riders, mounted on the bioengineered horses that were proving surprisingly resistant to the new environment. They ranged across the wasteland that had been productive farmland, exploring the trench networks that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. They found corpses, thousands of them, still in position, still gripping weapons, killed not by battle, but by the air itself. Some had tried to seal their trenches, create airtight bunkers. Others had just accepted death when it came. The Death Riders executed any survivors they found. Not out of cruelty, though. Cruelty existed in abundance on both sides by then, but practicality. Resources were scarce. Ferrograd could barely support its own population. And besides, these were traitors. The sentence for treason was death. The method was irrelevant. Within 6 months of the purging, organized resistance on Krieg had ceased to exist. The planet belonged to the Loyalists by default. They'd won. The victory tasted like ashes. Colonel Jurten died 18 months after the purging. Not from radiation. Ferrograd's environmental systems had held, barely, and he'd had access to rad purging treatments that extended his lifespan past what it should have been. No, he died from exhaustion. From the simple fact that his body, pushed beyond all reasonable limits by stress and malnutrition and the weight of commanding a dying world, finally gave out. He was 43 years old, looked 70, moved like 90. They found him in his quarters, slumped over tactical displays showing the planet's current population estimates. Somewhere around 11 billion down from the pre-war 53, still dying, the number dropping daily. His last order, written in shaking hand on physical paper because the data slate had been judged less secure: continue resistance, await Imperial restoration, do not surrender, do not compromise, we are loyal, the Emperor protects. It was signed simply Jurten, 83rd Krieg, Colonel, not his first name. Historical records suggest it was Gethic or something similar, but he never used it officially. Not his rank in full, just the essentials: regiment, position, duty. They buried him without ceremony, no tomb, no monument. Just another corpse in Krieg's frozen ground, indistinguishable from the billions who'd preceded him. He would have approved. Archmagos Grell survived him by decades, would ultimately survive to see Krieg's reintegration into the Imperium in late M40. And in those intervening centuries, he'd ensure that Jurten's legacy endured in a form the Colonel himself would have despised with every fiber of his being: the Vitae wounds. The problem was obvious to anyone with eyes. Krieg's population was collapsing, not just from the initial die-off, but from ongoing contamination. The radiation had contaminated everything: food, water, the very air in sections of the hive cities where seals had failed. Mutation rates were through the roof. Infant mortality approaching 90%. Fertility plummeting as reproductive systems failed under cellular damage. At current rates, Krieg would be extinct within 3 generations. The surviving leadership, military officers, and Mechanicus tech priests, mostly, the civilian government, having largely ceased to function, understood this. Debated solutions. Evacuation was discussed and dismissed. Where would they go, and with what ships? The orbital facilities had been destroyed early in the Civil War. They were trapped. That's when Grell made his proposal. The Vitae womb, an old technology, pre-imperial, possibly even pre-strife. The Mechanicus had fragments of the design, incomplete schematics recovered from various archaeological sites across the galaxy. They had never actually built one. Too many ethical concerns, too many practical limitations, too much resistance from baseline humanity that viewed artificial gestation as abhorrent. But Krieg was desperate. And desperate populations don't have the luxury of ethical qualms. Grell presented it to the Command Council, explained the basic concept: artificial wombs that could gestate human embryos from conception to birth. Not cloning exactly. That required a genetic template and produced identical copies. The Vitae womb used standard genetic material, created through the normal fertilization process, but the growth occurred externally. We harvest genetic material from viable donors, Grell explained, his mechanical voice devoid of emotion. Create embryos in controlled conditions, implant them in the wombs. 9 months later, new citizens of Krieg. That's an abomination, someone said. Major Thrask, maybe. One of the few original officers who'd survived both the siege and Jurten's purges. It's survival, Grell countered. Natural reproduction is failing. This succeeds. Simple mathematics. Colonel Jurten would never have approved this. Grell paused. Let the silence stretch. Then, Colonel Jurten's final weeks were spent considering this very proposal. He was conflicted, recognized the necessity but struggled with the implications. In his last conversation with me, he said, Grell paused, as if accessing memory files. He said that if artificial means were required to preserve loyal population, then the Emperor would forgive the method for the sake of the outcome. This was a lie, complete fabrication. Jurten had rejected the Vitae womb concept violently when Grell first mentioned it, called it obscene, an insult to human dignity and the natural order the Emperor intended. His exact words, according to witnesses, I'd rather see Krieg die human than survive as some Mechanicus breeding project. But Jurten was dead, and the dead can't contradict convenient myths. The Council, desperate and running out of options, voted to proceed, narrow margin, many abstaining, but enough support to move forward. Grell began construction immediately. The Vitae wombs were disturbing. That's the kindest description. Massive cylindrical structures, 2 meters tall, composed of vat-grown tissue, human tissue, cultured and modified, suspended in nutrient fluids and wrapped in life support machinery. Each one could gestate a single fetus from implantation to birth. Grell built hundreds, then thousands. Entire factory floors beneath Farograd devoted to human production. The Mechanicus biologists assisted, fascinated despite themselves by the engineering challenge, creating synthetic placentas, programming nutrient delivery systems, solving the 1,000 small problems that occurred when you tried to replicate a natural process artificially. The first generation of Vitae born came to term 9 months after the project started. The birth process was mechanical. The womb systems detected full gestation and began contractions, expelled the infant into a collection chamber where servitors cleaned and processed it before handing it off to whom? There were no parents, no families waiting. The infants went to communal nurseries, raised collectively, fed, clothed, educated according to strict protocols designed to produce obedient, capable soldiers. Because that's what Krieg needed now. Not civilians, not artists or merchants or any of the 1,000 roles that make a society function. Just soldiers. Tools to fulfill the debt that Jurten had incurred. They grew fast, not unnaturally. No growth acceleration, that was beyond the Mechanicus' capabilities. But they were pushed hard. Physical training began at age 5. Weapon drills at 7. By 10, they were proficient in basic infantry tactics. By 15, ready for deployment. And they were strange. The officers who'd known pre-war Krieg noticed it immediately. These children lacked something fundamental. Curiosity. Individuality. They asked no questions beyond those necessary for their training. Formed no attachments to peers. Showed no interest in anything beyond their designated function. Someone records don't say who, started calling them corpsmen, the core of Krieg's new military, the essential element. The name stuck, eventually evolving into Korps through linguistic drift and deliberate rebranding. The Death Korps, born in artificial wombs, raised in underground bunkers, trained on a planet whose surface was toxic wasteland. No childhood, no family, no identity beyond their function. Perfect soldiers in their way. Terrible, tragic, perfect soldiers. Grell watched his creation with clinical satisfaction. The survival rate was acceptable. 70% made it to deployable age, which was better than natural reproduction under current conditions. They were obedient, skilled, fearless, and they believed. Oh, how they believed. The theological indoctrination started early, drilled into them alongside weapons training and tactical doctrine. Krieg had sinned, rebelled against the Emperor. The sin was collective, the guilt inherited. Every Krieger born bore the stain of that original rebellion and owed the Emperor a debt, payable only in blood. Their deaths would redeem the world. Slowly, one life at a time, until the debt was satisfied. Of course, the debt would never be satisfied. Couldn't be. Mathematically, how do you repay the murder of billions? How many lives equals redemption for nuclear genocide? The answer? All of them. Every Krieger. Forever. The Vitae wombs continued production for centuries. Still operate in M41. Krieg's only real industry now. The planet produces nothing except soldiers. Tens of millions annually, raised in underground cities that spread like tumors through the irradiated crust. The Mechanicus biologist frowns on the practice officially, considers it borderline tech heresy. Artificial gestation violates several treaties and imperial edicts about genetic manipulation, human sanctity. But they don't stop it, because the Imperium needs bodies, and Krieg provides them. Needs soldiers willing to die without hesitation. And Krieg has those in abundance. Needs regiments that can weather conditions that would break normal humans. And the Death Korps excel in environments that mirror their terrible homeworld. So the wombs keep operating. The production continues. And every year, another generation of Kriegers emerges from the vats, takes up their masks and shovels, and marches off to die for sins they didn't commit, to redeem a world that can never be redeemed. There's a moment every Krieger experiences, usually during their final training exercise on the surface. They're handed an entrenching tool. Simple thing, really. Just a sharpened blade attached to a wooden handle, collapsible for easy storage, and told to dig. Dig through frozen earth. Dig through permafrost that hasn't thawed in centuries. Dig through soil so saturated with radiation that it glows faintly in the dark. Dig until your hands bleed inside your gloves. Dig until your shoulders scream. Dig until the trench's regulation depth, 2 meters, wide enough for 2 men to pass, deep enough to survive artillery. Then dig some more. The trainers don't explain why, don't need to. The Kriegers understand instinctively what the shovel represents, and it's not just a tool, it's a sacrament, an act of penance made physical. Every scoop of earth removed is a sin acknowledged. Every meter of trench completed is a prayer answered. The act of digging, methodical, endless, grinding, mirrors the nature of their redemption. There's no finish line, no moment when the debt is paid and you can rest. You dig until you die, and maybe, the Emperor will accept your offering. Other Imperial Guard regiments don't understand this. They see the Krieg obsession with trench warfare and assume it's purely tactical. After all, Krieg's civil war was won through attrition in trenches. The Death Korps learned to fight in those conditions, excel in them through brutal experience. Makes sense they'd apply those lessons elsewhere. But that's surface analysis, misses the deeper truth. For the Death Korps, trenches aren't just defensive positions. They're theology made manifest. The earth is Krieg, poison, damaged, unworthy. by digging into it, by carving order from chaos, by creating structure in the wasteland. They're attempting to heal it. Not literally. The radiation will last millennia. They know this. But spiritually, symbolically. Every trench is an apology carved into their homeworld's flesh. The entrenching tool serves double duty. Primarily, yes, it's for digging. But when the enemy closes to melee range, as they inevitably do, because the Death Korps fight at ranges where you can see the whites of hostile eyes, the shovel becomes a weapon. Brutal weapon, too. Kriegers train in shovel combat the way catechans train with knives. The sharpened edge can decapitate a man with a proper swing. The flat of the blade breaks bones through armor. The weighted balance makes it effective for blocking and parrying. It's crude compared to chainswords or power weapons, but in the mud and blood of trench fighting, crude works. There's a particular technique they teach in the Schola Progenium on Krieg. The instructors demonstrated on training dummies first, synthetic bodies that bleed realistic fluids when damaged, then make the students practice on decommissioned servitors, then on each other with blunted tools but full-force strikes. The technique is simple. Horizontal swing at neck level. Follow through. Don't stop until the blade passes completely through the target's cervical spine. Students who hesitate get beaten. Literally. The instructors, scarred veterans of 100 campaigns, missing fingers and eyes and pieces of their souls, will strike hesitant students with the training shovels hard enough to break ribs. Because hesitation kills. Mercy kills. In the trenches, you swing or you die, and the Death Korps don't die unnecessarily. They die when ordered, when tactically appropriate, when their deaths achieve objectives, but never because they hesitated. Commissar Deschênes, attached to the 19th Krieg Siege Regiment during the Vorton Compliance, wrote about this in his reports. I watched a Krieger kill 17 enemy combatants in close quarters with nothing but an entrenching tool. He moved through the trench like a machine, each strike precisely placed, no wasted movement. When he finished, standing ankle-deep in blood that wasn't his, he immediately began reinforcing the captured position. Didn't even clean his weapon first. Just started digging, mixing the blood into the soil like it was part of the construction process. I asked him later why he hadn't used his las rifle. Ammunition conservation? The weapon had jammed? He just stared at me through that damned mask and said, "The shovel is more honest, Commissar. Guns kill at distance. The shovel requires commitment." I didn't know what to say to that. Still don't. The Death Korps request the worst deployments. Actively request them. When the Departamento Militarum issues campaign orders, most regiments pray they'll be assigned to easier theaters. Garrison duty on compliant worlds, peacekeeping operations, anything except the meat grinders. Krieg requests the meat grinders specifically. Vortan? Planetary siege expected to last decades. Casualty projections in the millions. Toxic atmosphere requiring constant respirator use. The Death Korps volunteered. Sent 20 regiments. Octarius? War zone where orcs fight tyrannids in an endless slaughter, where human forces are just a footnote in a conflict between Xenos horrors. Krieg deployed 30 regiments and kept requesting more. Vraks, 17-year siege of a fortress world turned traitor, where every meter of ground cost 1,000 lives, and victory meant inheriting an irradiated wasteland. The Death Korps considered it a pilgrimage, sent everything they could spare. The Militarum learned quickly. When you need a war won through sheer bloody-minded attrition, when you need soldiers who will advance into artillery fire without flinching, when you need a regiment that considers 90% casualties an acceptable trade for objective completion, you call Krieg. This creates a perverse dynamic. The Imperium enables the Death Korps' suicidal tendencies by giving them exactly what they want. And the Death Korps enable the Imperium's worst strategic impulses by making attrition warfare viable again. Other regiments hate serving alongside them, not because they're ineffective. The opposite. The Death Korps are terrifyingly effective, but their presence warps the battlefield calculus. Commanders start making decisions they wouldn't otherwise consider. We can take that position, we'll just need to spend about 10,000 Kriegers doing it. The math becomes simple. Cruel, but simple. And the Kriegers reinforce this. They don't protest, don't request better tactics or equipment or any consideration for their survival. They just salute, pick up their shovels, and march into certain death with the same mechanical precision they bring to everything. Commissars assigned to Krieg regiments report psychological damage, not from the usual guard problems, cowardice, mutiny, despair. The opposite. They develop a condition informally called Krieg syndrome. Symptoms include inability to assess normal risk. After watching Kriegers walk through minefields to clear them with their bodies, regular guard tactics seem cowardly. Emotional numbing. The sheer volume of death becomes background noise. Survivor's guilt, but inverted. Feeling guilty for not dying alongside the Kriegers. Gradual acceptance of the Krieg worldview, that life is currency, death is achievement, and the only morality that matters is serving the Emperor through obliteration. Some commissars request transfer. Others don't, not because they want to stay, but because they've forgotten there's anywhere else to go. They've internalized the trenches, the masks, the endless digging. Become Krieg in spirit, if not in birth. The truly disturbing cases are commissars who start preventing Krieg self-sacrifice. Not out of mercy, but because the waste offends them tactically. Commissar Karsten became infamous for this during the Kasser Tyrock defense. A Krieg engineer squad had rigged themselves as living bombs, planning to charge an enemy armor column and detonate. Suicide attack, high probability of success. They were eager for it in their emotionless way. Karsten shot the squad leader, executed him for wasting Imperial resources. The other Kriegers stared at him, confused. Weren't they expendable? Wasn't this their purpose? Your purpose, Karsten said, is to kill the Emperor's enemies. Not to die prettily. If you blow yourselves up, you get one kill, maybe a few if you're lucky. If you use those explosives to mine the approach and fall back to prepared positions, you can kill dozens, hundreds. Die later after you've earned it. The Kriegers processed this, nodded, followed orders. They still died that day, but they took an entire enemy regiment with them instead of just a handful of tanks. Karsten considered it a victory. The Death Korps considered it. They didn't know what to consider it. The concept of dying efficiently rather than just dying was novel, foreign, but it was an order from a commissar. So they adapted. This is what makes them terrifying. They're not mindless. They can learn, adjust, apply tactical lessons. They just start from a baseline assumption that their lives have negative value, that existing is a sin requiring correction through death, and build from there. Give them an order to die, they'll die. Give them an order to kill and then die, they'll optimize the killing first. The theology supporting this is, it's not chaos corruption. Important to understand that. The Inquisition has investigated Krieg multiple times, always looking for signs of taint. They never find any. The Death Korps worship the Emperor exclusively, follow the Imperial Creed, reject the ruinous powers absolutely. Their faith is pure. That's what makes it so terrible. They believe the Emperor is divine, that he sits on the golden throne, suffering eternal agony to protect humanity, that every breath that they take is an insult to his sacrifice, because they're alive and unworthy while he suffers and is perfect. The only way to approach worthiness is through service, through sacrifice, through dying in his name, so that your worthless life at least purchases something of value, a few meters of ground taken, an enemy position destroyed, an objective secured. It's guilt weaponized, shame industrialized. Self-loathing mass produced in vitae wombs and refined through brutal training until it achieves a kind of terrible purity. The ecclesiarchy doesn't know what to make of them. Officially, the Death Korps are lauded as exemplars of faith, held up as models of devotion. But privately, theologians debate whether their beliefs constitute heresy. Not chaos heresy, something else. A deviation from the approved imperial creed that's nonetheless useful enough to tolerate. Some argue the Kriegers have inverted the relationship between humanity and the Emperor. The creed teaches that the Emperor sacrificed himself for humanity, that we owe him gratitude and service. Krieg teaches that humanity is inherently guilty, that we owe the Emperor death as recompense for existing. It's a subtle distinction, but theologically it's massive. Others counter that it doesn't matter. Heresy is defined by action, not belief. The Death Korps fight for the Imperium, kill its enemies, never waver in loyalty. What does it matter if their reasoning is unorthodox? The outcome is orthodox. That's sufficient. This argument usually wins. Because the Imperium needs bodies, and Krieg provides them. Needs faith, and Krieg has it in abundance. Needs soldiers who won't break, and the Death Korps are unbreakable. So the cult of the shovel continues. The digging never stops. And every year new regiments march out from Krieg's underground cities, shovels slung over shoulders, masks hiding faces that were never meant to be seen. They deploy to the galaxy's worst battlefields. They dig, they fight, they die. And the planet that made them counts each death as a payment toward a debt that can never be fully repaid. Because that's the final cruelty of Krieg's theology. There's no redemption at the end. No moment when the Emperor says, enough, you've suffered sufficiently, you're forgiven. There's only the shovel, the earth, and the endless work of apologizing for the crime of being born. If there's a hell specifically designed for the Death Korps of Krieg, it would look exactly like Vraks, and they'd consider it paradise. Vraks Secundus, Fortress World, arms depot for the entire Scarus sector, population negligible, defenses absurd, strategic value critical. In M37, the Cardinal Astra of the world, a man named Zaphen, whose name is now synonymous with treachery, declared independence from the Imperium and invited chaos forces to aid his defense. The Departamento Militarum assessed the situation, calculated that reclaiming Vraks would require sustained siege operations in hostile environment against entrenched fanatical defenders. Casualty projections, millions, timeline, years, possibly decades. They asked which regiments were available. Krieg volunteered everything. The 88th Siege Army, comprising 12 full regiments, roughly 120,000 soldiers, deployed in M40.680. Their orders were simple: reclaim Vraks, kill all traitors, secure the arsenal. The siege lasted 17 years. By the end, more than 14 million Imperial Guardsmen had died on Vraks, most of them Krieg. The planet's surface had been transformed from barren rock to something worse, a landscape of craters and trenches and the unburied dead, where the soil itself was composed more of corpses than actual earth. The Death Korps considered it their finest hour. Understanding Vraks requires understanding the geography. The world was never pleasant. Cold, atmospherically thin, tectonically unstable. The Imperium had chosen it precisely because it was miserable. Garrison duty there was punishment. The only reason to station forces there was to guard the massive underground arsenals carved into the planet's crust. Cardinal Zaphen had spent decades fortifying defense lasers that could crack battleships in orbit, void shields covering the primary fortifications, trench networks that made Krieg's Civil War battlefields look like children's sandcastles, and worst of all, the arsenals themselves. Zaphen controlled enough weapons to outfit 100 regiments. His defenders were well-armed, well-trained, and absolutely committed to their heresy. The Imperial Navy couldn't simply bombard the planet from orbit. Destroying the arsenals would have been counterproductive. They needed those weapons intact, which meant ground assault, which meant trenches, which meant Krieg. The first Krieg regiments landed and immediately began digging. Not toward objectives, not toward enemy positions, just digging. Establishing their own trench networks, creating the infrastructure of siege warfare. Other Guard regiments watched in confusion as the Kriegers spent weeks excavating, building elaborate underground bunkers and supply tunnels, turning a flat plain into a subterranean city. When are they going to attack? Other commanders asked. The Krieg commander, Colonel 158 of the 88th numbers as names, always numbers, responded, "When the ground is ready." It took 3 months before the Krieg forces advanced. When they did, it wasn't a glorious charge. It was methodical, professional, boring almost in its mechanical precision. They'd dig a trench forward, 100 meters, 200 if the ground permitted, reinforce it, move artillery up, dig again. The enemy would shell them. Kriegers would die, dozens, hundreds, but the survivors would keep digging. Eventually they'd reach enemy positions. Then the real killing started. Trench raids became the primary combat method. Small teams, usually 10 to 20 Kriegers, would go over the top at night, crossing no man's land in silence, hitting enemy trenches with grenade and bayonet and shovel. Brutal close quarters combat in confined spaces where the only sounds were breathing through respirators and the wet impact of sharpened steel and flesh. The Kriegers excelled at this. No fear, no hesitation. They'd drop into enemy trenches like death incarnate, clearing positions with mechanical efficiency. If they took casualties, and they always took casualties, the survivors would signal for reinforcements and continue the assault. No retreat. Or retreat. Forward or dead, those were the options. The defenders learned to fear the night, because that's when the Kriegers came. Silence, then sudden violence, then silence again as the Death Korps consolidated their gains and began digging new trenches and captured territory. Meter by meter, they took Vraks. The casualty reports from those early years are numbing in their repetition. 14th Regiment, 3rd Company, 100% casualties. Objective secured. 91st Regiment, 2nd Battalion, 87% casualties. Objective secured. 103rd Regiment, Heavy Weapons Platoon, 94% casualty. Objective secure, always objective secure. The Kriegers might die, but they didn't fail. Couldn't fail because failure would mean their deaths were wasted. Better to die achieving nothing than survive achieving nothing. Wait, no, better to die achieving something than survive achieving something. Better to just die, that was the point. The siege ground on. Years passed. The initial 12 regiments were reinforced, then reinforced again. The Militarum kept sending bodies and Krieg kept providing them. At peak deployment, there were over 80 Krieg regiments on Vraks simultaneously. Nearly 1 million soldiers, all digging, all fighting, all dying in trenches that stretched across an entire continent. The defenders fought back savagely. They had Chaos Space Marines, small war bands, nothing like full Legion strength, but terrifying nonetheless. Demon engines, cultist fanatics high on warp dust and religious mania. They counterattacked constantly, trying to break the slow Imperial advance. It never worked. You can't break the Death Korps. They don't have morale to shatter. You can kill them. They make it easy, honestly, walking into fire with that mechanical precision, but you can't make them rout. You can't make them surrender. Can't even make them slow down. Kill 100 Kriegers advancing on your position, and 200 more will take their place tomorrow, stepping over the corpses of yesterday's assault like they're stones in a river. The war developed patterns, rhythms. Artillery barrages at dawn. Infantry raids at dusk. Night belonged to the Kriegers. Day belonged to whoever could survive the shelling. In the trenches, Kriegers lived like... Actually, lived isn't the right word. They existed in the trenches, months at a time without returning to rear areas. They slept sitting up, respirators on, rifles across laps, ate nutrient paste squeezed through feeding tubes, defecated in designated trenches that were regularly shelled to destroy waste. No comfort, no rest, just the rhythm of war. Other guard regiments rotated out. Standard procedure: keep soldiers in combat too long and they break. The Militarum would pull exhausted regiments back, replace them with fresh troops. Not Krieg. The Death Korps stayed in the trenches until they died or until the sector was secured. No rotation, no rest. Just forward progress measured in corpses per meter. Commissar Chiron served on Vraks for 4 years. His journal entries chart his psychological collapse. Year 1, month 3. The Kriegers are impressive, disciplined, effective. I've never seen soldiers maintain such focus under constant bombardment. Year 2, month 7. I shot a Krieger today for attempting unauthorized advance. He'd rigged himself with explosives, planning to breach enemy bunkers solo. This is the 3rd time this month I've had to prevent suicides disguised as tactics. They're too eager. It's unnatural. Year 3, month 2. I don't remember what non-Krieg soldiers look like. I don't remember what it's like to serve with men who want to survive. I've been here too long. Need to request transfer. Year 3, month 11. Transfer denied. Apparently I'm one of the few commissars the Kriegers haven't broken. What does that say about me? I think I'm starting to understand them. That's terrifying. Year 4, month 1. Realized today I haven't removed my rebreather in 3 weeks. Don't remember why I bothered before. The air is poison anyway. Everything here is poison. We're all poison, spreading across Vraks like a plague that kills everything, including itself. The final entry is dated 3 days later. Objective secured. His body was never recovered. Probably in an unmarked mass grave with 10,000 Kriegers, indistinguishable from the soldiers he'd commanded. The turning point came in year 14. The Imperial forces finally breached the outer defensive ring of Cardinal Zaffin's primary fortress. Cost: 2 million casualties in a 6-month period. The Death Korps led the assault, wave after wave, filling trenches with their bodies until the defenders ran out of ammunition and the corpses formed bridges over the defensive obstacles. It wasn't tactics, it was just numbers, weight of bodies, the willingness to spend lives with such profligacy that the enemy couldn't kill them fast enough. When the walls finally fell, the Kriegers poured through the breach. What happened in the fortress interior isn't well documented. Imperial records just say close quarters combat and move on. But survivors, few as they were, spoke of corridors choked with the dead, of Kriegers advancing through rooms so thick with corpses you had to climb over them, of the absolute mechanical murder that the Death Korps inflicted on anyone who didn't die fast enough. Cardinal Zaffin died at his altar, they say, killed by a Krieger with a shovel. The soldier didn't even report the kill. Just moved on to the next enemy, the next room, the next target. The siege officially ended in M40.697. 17 years. 14 million Imperial casualties. The planet's surface completely destroyed. Nothing but trenches and craters and the ruins of fortifications. The arsenal secured, mostly intact. Strategic victory. The Death Korps were lauded. Commendations, awards. The survivors were offered rest, rotation back to Krieg for retraining and redeployment. They requested immediate assignment to the next siege operation. Because Vraks hadn't broken them, hadn't even tested them really. It had just been normal. The natural state of existence for soldiers who'd been born in a wasteland and trained in trenches. 17 years of grinding attrition, of daily death, of slow progress measured in blood and earth. That was just Tuesday for Krieg. The Imperium learned from Vraks. Learned that you could throw bodies at a problem if you had enough bodies, and they didn't mind being thrown. Learned that the Death Korps were the solution to a specific type of warfare, the kind where victory matters more than the victory's cost. And Krieg learned nothing, because Krieg already knew, had always known, since the moment Jurten launched those atomics and transformed paradise into purgatory. The only way out is through. The only peace is death. The only redemption is in the grave. Dig, fight, die, repeat, forever. There's a prayer the Death Korps say before battle. It's not in any approved ecclesiarchy text. The priests don't teach it in the Schola Progenium. You won't find it inscribed on cathedral walls or illuminated in the books of saints. The Kriegers just know it. Pass it between themselves in the trenches, in the rare moments when they speak at all. Whisper it through their respirators before going over the top. It goes, Emperor, accept this offering. My life for your glory. My death for your Imperium. I am unworthy, but my ending may have worth. Take what is yours. I owe everything. I pay in blood, that's it. No requests for protection. No pleas for victory. No hope for survival. Just, here's my death. Please let it mean something. Understanding the Death Korps requires understanding that they don't fear death. They crave it, not in a cornet bloodlust sense. There's no ecstasy there, no joy in violence for its own sake. It's more like relief. The way a penitent flagellant feels when the whip finally stops, when the pain ends and absolution begins. For the Kriegers, life is the punishment, death is the reward. This creates a paradox that drives other Imperial forces insane. The Death Korps are simultaneously the most effective soldiers the Imperium fields and the most strategically frustrating. They'll accomplish any objective you give them, but they'll do it in the most casualty-intensive way possible. Because casualties aren't a cost to be minimized. They're an opportunity to be maximized. Give a Cadian regiment a fortified position to take, they'll reconnoiter, find the weak point, coordinate combined arms assault with armor and air support, minimize losses. Give a Krieger regiment the same objective, they'll walk directly at the strongest point and keep walking until either the position falls or every Krieger is dead. Usually both. It works. Horrifying, it works. Because there's no defense against an enemy who treats death as victory conditioned. The masks hide faces, yes, but more importantly, they hide identity. Strip a Krieger of their mask, as the Inquisition has done, as commanding officers occasionally do during inspections, and you find a human face. Young, usually. Pale from underground living, often scarred, but human. Put the mask back on, though, and the humanity vanishes. They become functions. Parts of the great machine that is the Imperial Guard, except more expendable than usual because they're specifically designed to be spent. Some philosophers have theorized that the masks aren't to hide the Kriegers' faces from others. They're to hide the Kriegers from themselves, to prevent the dangerous emergence of individual identity. Because individuals question orders. Individuals want to live. Individuals are human. The Death Korps aren't allowed to be human. They're currency, and currency doesn't need a face. The truly horrifying question, the one that keeps Inquisitors awake despite knowing they shouldn't care, is this. What do they dream? Do they dream at all? In those rare hours when they sleep sitting upright in the trenches, respirators, recycling thin air, do images form behind their closed eyes? Do they see Krieg as it was, the paradise their ancestors destroyed? Do they imagine family, identity, a life beyond the shovel and the gun? Or is it just static? Empty darkness reflecting the void where personality should be. No one knows. You can't exactly ask. And if you did, the Krieger would probably just stare at you through their mask and say something like, Dreaming wastes time that could be spent digging. The closest anyone's come to understanding the interior life of a Krieger is through the rare cases where they survive long enough to speak. Not many do. Life expectancy for the Death Korps is measured in months, sometimes weeks. But occasionally, a Krieger will survive multiple campaigns, accumulate enough experience that the Militarum promotes them to sergeant or lieutenant, and they'll have to interact with non-Krieg officers who ask questions. Sergeant 4,779 of the 143rd served for 6 years. Unheard of longevity for Krieg. The regimental historian, every Guard regiment is supposed to keep records, though Kriegs are notably sparse, interviewed him. What do you remember from before your first deployment? Training. The surface. Cold. Do you have family? No. Friends? Comrades you're close to? My regiment. I mean individually. Specific soldiers you have bonds with. Pause. The kind of pause that suggests the question doesn't parse. Finally, bonds are irrelevant. If they die, others replace them. The regiment continues. What do you want? What are you fighting for? Another pause. Longer this time, then. To die well. To die for the Emperor. To finally rest. You want to die? Yes, then why haven't you? You've had opportunities. You could charge enemy positions alone. Guarantee your death. That would be selfish. Wasteful. My death belongs to the Emperor, not to me. I die when ordered, when tactically appropriate, when my death purchases something of value. And until then, I wait. I dig. I fight. I exist. Do you ever wish things were different? The longest pause yet. So long the historian thought the sergeant wasn't going to answer. Finally, I don't know how to wish. That interview ended there. Sergeant 4,779 died 3 weeks later in an assault on trader positions. Walked into a kill zone to draw fire so his squad could flank. Tactical sacrifice. Exactly what he described. Death with purpose, the Emperor's peace. That's what the Kriegers call death. Not metaphorically. They mean it literally. Death is peace. The only moment when the debt stops accumulating, when the guilt ceases, when existence finally ends and you can stop apologizing for being alive. This terrifies the Imperium, even as it exploits it. Because the Imperium runs on faith, yes, but it's supposed to be faith in life. Faith that your service matters, that your sacrifice protects something worth protecting, that humanity has a future worth fighting for. The Imperial Creed teaches suffering with purpose, endure the present horror so future generations might know peace. Krieg has inverted this. For them, there is no future, there's only the endless present of penance. Future generations will be just as guilty, just as obligated, just as eager to die. The cycle never ends. Can't end. Because ending would mean forgiveness, and Krieg doesn't believe it deserves forgiveness. The Emperor, they're certain, will never say enough. Will never release them from their obligation. So they'll keep dying, forever, until either the Imperium falls or Krieg's population is exhausted. And then what? They'll grow more. The Vitae wombs will produce another generation, and another, and another. Industrial scale guild, mass-produced and deployed across the galaxy. Some inquisitors have argued for shutting it down. Classify Krieg as theologically aberrant. Force them to adopt standard imperial creed practices. Maybe reduce their tithe obligations, let a few generations grow up without the crushing weight of inherited sin. These proposals never go anywhere. Because the Departamento Militarum looks at the numbers and sees Krieg provides 50+ regiments annually. Krieg regiments have 94% objective completion rate. Krieg regiments never require commissarial executions for cowardice. Krieg regiments never surrender. Krieg regiments never retreat without orders. Krieg regiments never ever stop. And the Militarum does the math and concludes, we need this. The Imperium needs this. Humanity needs soldiers willing to die without question. and Krieg provides them. So the Death Korps continue. The shovels keep digging, the masks keep hiding, the Vitae wombs keep producing, and every year millions of Kriegers march off to war seeking the only reward they've ever wanted, the Emperor's peace, the right to stop existing. Epilogue. The debt that cannot be paid. There's a monument on Krieg. Not in the grand sense, no towering statuary, no gilded aquilas, no marble halls echoing with the names of heroes. Just a marker, a simple stone slab in the frozen wastes outside what used to be Hive Ferrograd. Now just another section of the underground city network that houses Krieg's dwindling civilian population. The inscription is worn almost smooth by centuries of radioactive wind. But if you know where to look, if you trace the letters with gloved fingers the way pilgrims sometimes do, you can still read it. Here lies Colonel Jurten, 83rd Krieg. He saved this world by destroying it. May the Emperor judge him more kindly than we do. No one knows who carved it. The records don't say. Probably one of the original loyalists, someone who'd served under Jurten and understood, or tried to understand, what he had done and why. Someone who wanted to mark the grave of the man who'd murdered billions to save their souls. The Death Korps don't visit it. They're not sentimental, don't do pilgrimages or memorials or any of the rituals that other regiments use to honor their dead. The dead are gone. Returned to the Emperor. Their names, if they had names, carved onto their debt and filed away. But sometimes when fresh regiments are loading into troop transports for deployment off-world, a commissar or Militarum official will point it out. Say something like, "That's where it started. That's why you exist." The Kriegers will look. Process the information with the same mechanical efficiency they bring to everything. Then, they'll board the ships and leave, heading for whatever nightmare war zone needs their particular brand of salvation through annihilation. In the Strategium of Terra, in rooms where the High Lords of the Imperium make decisions that shape the fates of quadrillions, Krieg is a line item, a resource, an assumption built into strategic planning. We need to retake the Varden cluster. Estimated casualties, 4 to 6 million over 3 years. Deploy Krieg. They'll do it in 2. And they will, because the Death Korps don't care about odds or survival rates or any of the calculations that would give normal commanders pause. You point them at an objective and they'll achieve it or die trying, usually both. In the end, the Death Korps of Krieg are proof of something terrible about the Imperium, about humanity, about faith itself. You can take people, real people, with the potential for joy and love and hope and all the things that make life worth living, and you can break them. Systematically, deliberately. You can erase their personalities, their dreams, their very sense of self. You can replace it all with guilt and duty and the absolute certainty that they deserve to die. And if you do it right, if you program it deep enough, they won't resist. They'll embrace it. They'll thank you for the opportunity to suffer. They'll compete for the chance to throw themselves into the meat grinder. They'll become perfect soldiers, and the galaxy will call them heroes. Somewhere beneath Krieg's frozen surface and the Vitae womb facilities that stretch for kilometers under the radioactive wasteland, another generation is being born. They'll grow in synthetic chambers, emerge into a world that never wanted them, be trained to die for sins they didn't commit. They'll pick up their shovels, put on their masks, march to the dropships that will carry them to wars they don't understand on worlds they'll never return from. And they'll do it willingly, eagerly even. Because for the Death Korps of Krieg, this is mercy. This is love. This is the only path to redemption they've ever known. Dig, fight, die, repeat until the Emperor says otherwise. He never will. But they'll keep waiting, keep digging, keep dying. Because what else is there? Paradise is dead, burned away by atomics and buried under 10,000 years of ice and ash and guilt. All that remains is the shovel, the mask, and the endless work of apologizing to a god who isn't listening. The Death Korps of Krieg are a monument to what happens when faith curdles into fanaticism, when loyalty becomes slavery, when love for the Emperor transforms into hatred for the self. There, everything the Imperium claims to stand against and everything it actually embodies. And they'll never stop, never question, never hope for anything except the peace that comes when you finally get to stop. The Emperor's peace, purchased with a shovel and paid for with a life that never should have existed in the first place. That's the cult of sacrifice. That's the Death Korps. That's Krieg for the Emperor. Always for the Emperor. Until the debt is paid. Which is to say, forever. In the name of the Emperor, we dig. In the name of redemption, we fight. In the name of peace, we die. For we are Krieg, and we owe everything.